our pleasure today to be speaking with Professor Matthew Emerson, who is the Dean of Theology, Arts, and Humanities at Oklahoma Baptist University. He's also one of the co-authors of the text that we'll be discussing today, Baptists and the Christian Tradition Towards an Evangelical Baptist Catholicity. Professor Emerson, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, glad to join you. Thanks for having me.
Professor Emerson, the last time we talked was before COVID. So how did COVID treat you, and what were some of the lessons that you learned out of teaching under lockdown?
Yeah, well, we did, my family and I, we contracted COVID in January of 2021. So we made it through all of 2020. And then in 2021, we finally did contract it. And it was a rough few days for sure. But I'm glad the Lord sustained us in that. And, in terms of what we learned and how it formed us and shaped us, I think renewing our understanding of the importance of rest. So I think COVID can, the COVID lockdown made some people restless, and that was certainly true for us at some point, but especially in the beginning, just almost being forced to take a time of rest and be with our family and not be in so many activities was actually a blessing, even if eventually we got a bit stir crazy.
Cool. Thanks for sharing. Yeah. Professor Emerson, you are one of the founders of the Center for Baptist Renewal, and we'd love it if you'd just be able to share a little bit of your vision and what is it this Center for Baptist Renewal is about and aims to do.
Sure. Pretty, quite simply, we're trying to help Baptist pastors and churches and lay people have access to the resources of the entire Christian tradition for the health of their beliefs and the health of their church practice. So we talk about and try to help people understand some of the ways that the early church is connected to us in terms of our beliefs, in terms of Christian orthodoxy. We try to help people understand how we're connected to the early church in terms of our worship practices. We also regularly try to connect them specifically to our own Baptist tradition. So what did early Baptists say about what we should believe, about what we should do in church, how we should practice church discipline, those sorts of things. So what we're trying to do is simply retrieve the Christian tradition, and particularly the Baptist tradition, for the sake of Baptist churches today.
In this tagline, this championing of Baptist Catholicity, is that a phrase that your community developed for this center, or is that sourced out of some piece of literature that I've not yet read?
Yeah, so actually that's not a phrase that we coined. There are a group of British Baptists who often write and speak about these kinds of topics, not exactly in the same approach that we take at CBR, but a group of, especially led by Anthony Cross, Philip Thompson. And so there's actually a couple of volumes called or known by a couple of different titles in a series on Studies of Baptist History and Theology that was with Paternoster. One of those volumes is Toward a Baptist Catholicity, and that is by a Baptist theologian named Steve Harmon. Steve is now at Gardner-Webb University. And I think I would be fair, and actually Steve wrote the appendix to the book we're talking about today. Steve does not take the same kind of theological approach as Luke and I do, or the other authors in that volume. He did, I don't know if coining a phrase is the right way to put it, but he certainly is one of the pioneers in this area, even if we don't take the same approach as him. We've gone back and forth online a bit in a friendly way. And I think it would be fair to say, I think Steve agrees with this, that he takes more of a post-liberal approach to addressing issues of ecumenicity and doctrine, whereas Luke and I would identify with more of the Kevin Van Hooser kind of strain of 21st century theological method, where truth is objective, can be found in the text, this sort of thing. And I that may not be the way Steve exactly would put it, but that's the way we've tried to explain it. And so it does originate elsewhere. We're trying to articulate what Baptist Catholicity is in a 21st century American theologically conservative environment.
Really cool. I don't think we've had this conversation, but some of our viewers may know that I went to Fordham University, studied with the Jesuits there. I'm very into ressourcement theology. I think it's one of the most important movements of the 20th century for the global church. So I'm really excited about what your project is and what you're developing there. Let's see if I can just read a quick line. This is from page 351. This is from the conclusion that you and also your co-author R. Lucas Stamps put together, a little bit of a manifesto, if I may say that, for this center. And you start by saying retrieval for the sake of renewal is the watchword of this volume. I noticed that it was also that phrase, retrieval for the sake of renewal, is also the title of an article that Timothy George published in First Things in 2017, noting the founding of this center. So I'm hearing this in stereo. Retrieval for the sake of renewal is really the mission, the clarion call of the Baptist Center, for the Center for Baptist Renewal. How does your vision of ressourcement there at CBR, how does that differ from perhaps other visions of ressourcement that we may be aware of?
Well, I don't know that our vision of ressourcement, broadly speaking, is all that different, because that's just trying to retrieve the past for the sake of the present as we engage moving towards the future. I think the difference in how we approach retrieving the past and to what end is going to be different, given the differences between Christian traditions. So a Roman Catholic approach to retrieval is going to look different, not because retrieval itself is different, but because there are different ends to that retrieval, related to proving the continuity of the tradition and demonstrating its authority, related to other ecclesial issues. And I think there's still some commonality for the ends, right? So if you read ressourcement literature, you're going to find talk about this renewal movement. So it's bringing the resources of the past into the present in order to help people in the present. So that's going to be common. There's still an emphasis on, at least in some sectors, an emphasis on exegesis. But depending on who you're talking to, retrieval is going to have a different end ecclesially, I think. For Baptists, we're not a hierarchical tradition, so we don't have a hierarchy beyond the authority of the local church. And so whereas other retrieval, other works of retrieval might aim towards sort of denomination-wide goals and ends, it might aim towards something related to a magisterium of some sort or a confession of faith. For Baptists, the aim is very particular, and it's an aim to bolster the ministry of the local church. So I think that's how I would describe some of those more subtle differences between retrieval projects.
Excellent. The process of retrieval is the same for different denominational bodies, but how that affects our church structures plays out really differently depending on where we are in the global church. Your article, Baptists and the Christian Tradition, explores the contours of Baptist Catholicity. And so in your chapter, Baptists, Baptism, and the Christian Tradition, you address the question of whether Baptist Catholicity is possible, or to what extent it is possible, in light of the Baptist distinctives of adult believers' baptism. What does baptism look like, the doctrine of baptism look like in this lens of Baptist Catholicity?
Yeah, so this tends to be the sticking point for people who engage with our project. So on the one hand, you have our fellow Baptists who would say, wait a minute, we're not in continuity with the Christian tradition, in particular in relation to baptism. On the other hand, you would have and in fact, in a number of Baptist circles, what you would find in that regard is a kind of sense of pride. Like we didn't follow the tradition. We broke from it in relation specifically to baptism. Outside of Baptist life, those who interact with our project repeatedly will say, listen, I like what y'all are doing, but I don't know how you get around the issue of baptism and still call yourselves, pursuing Catholicity, because you're denying the baptism of believers for 1,500 years. So it's the sticky wicket in a lot of ways. And what I say in the chapter essentially is that early Baptists did not see themselves as breaking from the Christian tradition with respect to baptism's purpose and meaning. What they wanted to reform was the mode and recipient of baptism. So early Baptists, if you read, and the chapter is taken up largely with quoting early Christian or early Baptist creeds and confessions, what you find is that the language used about the meaning and purpose of baptism is almost verbatim of what you're going to find throughout Christian history. Now, that's in a reformational mode, obviously. So they're not repeating late medieval Roman Catholic statements about baptism's meaning and purpose, but they are, so it's not sort of sacerdotal or a kind of Roman Catholic sacramentalism that they're repeating, late medieval Roman Catholic, but they are repeating and summarizing what Christians throughout space and time up to that point, and especially other reformational Christians, said about baptism's meaning and purpose. So they see that, in other words, what I read that as saying is they see a lot of continuity with all Christians related to what baptism is. What they want to reform is who receives baptism, so not infants, but professing believers, and how to baptize. So not sprinkling or effusion, but immersion. And that's very different from the kind of narrative you get even from Baptists today, where this distinction in baptism is a distinction of kind rather than a distinction of recipient or mode. So that's the gist of the argument of the chapter.
That's very helpful, Professor Emerson. Let's shift, if we can, to focusing on the Lord's Supper. So help us through this. Can one both reach for Catholicity and maintain the distinctives of a memorialist position concerning the Lord's Supper?
Well, I'll simply gesture toward another Baptist who's addressed this in answering this question. Whether or not you take a memorialist position on the supper is not actually what distinguishes the Baptist position. So again, early Baptists, even some British Baptists today, would take a more sacramental view of the supper. In fact, early Baptist views on the supper were almost entirely sacramental rather than strictly memorialist. And again, the chapter in the book written by Michael Haken makes that clear. He also has a chapter in the series I mentioned earlier, edited by Cross and Thompson, Baptist Sacramentalism is the name of the volume. He has a chapter in that volume on the Lord's Supper and early Baptist life as well. It's very clear that early Baptists believed in a kind of spiritual presence view of the Lord's Supper. So that's not the question, but I just wanted to state that to begin with, that memorialism is not the only Baptist view, nor is it the historic one, at least in terms of the very first Baptist. Nevertheless, it's the pervasive one today, especially in American Baptist life. And so, can you maintain Catholicity with a memorialist position? And I would say yes. There's a book called, I think it's just called The Lord's Supper. It's an edited volume in the NAC New American Commentary Theology series, and I think it's Jim Hamilton wrote a chapter in that volume on the memorialist position, acknowledging the presence of Christ in the supper, because when you remember God's act, he's present with you, right? So it's a bit different than saying he's present via the elements. So it's not a strictly spiritual presence view, but it is a view that acknowledges the presence of Christ at the Lord's Supper. It's tied more to the verbal aspect of proclamation and to the Lord's presence in the supper via that proclamation.
The Center for Baptist Renewal is doing some really cool work in bringing these older voices, these historic currents, into the life of various Baptist churches in your context. Do you involve yourself in ecumenical dialogue? Is that part of the portfolio of things that the center does?
So not officially. We don't have any official relationships in that regard. We participate in scholarly activities that place us in community and context with people from different traditions, including non-Protestant traditions. But we're not official representatives to any ecumenical body. Luke Stamps, who's one of our executive directors, has participated in a scholarly project on the theology of Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, and has a chapter on Benedict's anthropology. It's a Lexham volume. So engaging in Roman Catholic thought, but also identifying as a Protestant where it differs with us. And then this book is not out yet, but I'm going to have a chapter in a book on a Protestant Catholic dialogue document that was produced on the Word of God in the life of the church. And I'm giving the Southern Baptist response or a response from a Southern Baptist. So those are not official CBR representative capacities. We do, and so interpersonally and then academically, we have conversations, but we're not official representatives to the Vatican or anything like that.
Great. In the conclusion of this text, you offer 11 theses for the seeking to renew the church. And the 11th thesis in this list reads, "We believe all Christians should pray for and seek Christian unity across ecclesial and denominational lines, and that Baptists should not reflexively reject principled ecumenical dialogue with other Christian traditions." In your view, what are the core elements of a successful ecumenical dialogue?
Well, I would say that the main goal is actually pursuit of Christ. So interestingly, maybe not interestingly, I don't know. I tend to think that the further in we dive into our own traditions, the closer we come to one another. So the idea in ecumenical conversation is not necessarily to convince someone to jump ship, but rather to see the beauty of your own tradition in light of another tradition, deepen your understanding of your own tradition in light of another tradition, and in doing so, grow closer to Christ together. Now, we use the word principled in that statement for a reason, right? This is not some kind of squishy ecumenism where it's a kind of papering over differences or acting like differences don't matter, that some of them aren't very serious. We do think that the differences between some of the various traditions are incredibly serious, but that doesn't mean you can't engage in conversation with somebody. And it also doesn't mean that you can't help each other grow closer to Christ in some way, even by understanding your own tradition. So that's what I mean by principled ecumenism, and what I would say the purpose of ecumenism is. I think there are possibilities related to convincing somebody of your own position. And likewise, there's always a possibility you yourself could be convinced otherwise. I never have been, but I think intellectual honesty demands taking other people's positions seriously, at least in order to engage them in conversation. But that's not really the point of those conversations in my mind. The point is rather to grow closer to Christ by going deeper into your own tradition.
Excellent. Professor Emerson, one of the points of this dialogue that we facilitate through this YouTube channel is to allow scholars like yourself, thinkers from around the globe, to help us answer the question, what would a reunited church look like? Can you help us envision what it would look like for the church to be united? We, as Christian bodies all over the world, continued to pray passionately after the words that the Lord taught us to pray in John 17 for the unity of his church. What would that look like for the church to be united today?
Well, I think that's where it begins, is praying for one another. So when Christ says that they may be one as we are one, when he's in John 17, he's praying. That's a prayer. He's praying for us to be one. And so the unity of the church, the visible unity of the church, that is Catholicity of the church, begins with praying for one another. So I don't know what specifically a united church would look like in terms of polity and all that sort of thing. But I think just to begin with, it has to look like we pray for each other, and we do pray for each other. So well, people will ask us, well, what's a good step towards pursuing Baptist Catholicity? And the first thing we tell people is pray for other churches in your city. So pray for one another. Now, after that, I don't know. Other people, I was at a conference at Biola one time, and Peter Lightheart offered very specific ideas of what it would look like for the church to be united, which included, by the way, getting rid of all the Credo Baptists. But I don't want to speak into that level of detail. I'll just say pray for each other.
It's been our delight today to be speaking with Professor Matthew Emerson, the Dean for Theology, Arts, and Humanities at Oklahoma Baptist University, and also co-editor of the text that we've been discussing today, Baptists and the Christian Tradition Towards an Evangelical Baptist Catholicity, available from B&H Academic. Thank you so much, Professor Emerson, for speaking with us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.